If the gospel we preach has nothing to do with God's covenant with Israel, I believe we have missed something profound. That's a quote from Messianic Jewish scholar Dr. Jen Rosner, who's here with us today to discuss her passion and dedication to thinking critically about the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, and hopefully helping all of us to do the same. Messiah Podcast is brought to you by First Fruits of Zion, providing Messianic Jewish teaching for Christians and Jews.
Put your hand in mine together. We will walk in harmony. Let me introduce you to my teacher, the rabbi from the Galilee.
Covering some great ground here today, Jacob, our first scholarly podcast of season 2 as we welcome Dr. Rosner for some pretty deep conversation, but that's what scholars do, right? Deep.
Oh yeah, we're going to learn a lot today. Dr. Rosner got her PhD from Fuller Theological Seminary, where she's currently an affiliate assistant professor of systematic theology. She also holds academic posts at the King's University, Azusa Pacific University, and the Messianic Jewish Theological Institute.
Many people are familiar with Dr. Mark Kinzer, possibly Messianic Judaism's most respected scholar, and I might throw in a Messiah podcast guest from season 1. You should listen to that. It's about Luke. It's really tremendous. But this is what Dr. Kinzer had to say about Dr. Rosner, today's guest. Though still a young scholar, Jen Rosner has already established herself as one of the world's leading Messianic Jewish theologians. That's a pretty big deal when Mark Kinzer says that about you. But in coming years, he continues, her voice, balanced, erudite, incisive, will be heard widely and will reshape key features of the Jewish and Christian theological landscape.
Now, she's written a lot of meticulously cited, dense academic literature, but this year she's coming out with a new book. It's called Finding Messiah. And in this book, she puts the cookies on the bottom shelf. She makes it easy for everybody to understand what she's talking about, even as she explores these deep ideas and these controversial ideas. Yeah. And I don't want to give anything away because she's going to tell us a lot more about this book in her interview with us today.
Let's go and learn with Dr. Rosner.
If you want to know the Jewish Jesus, don't miss out on a free subscription to Messiah Magazine, where you'll discover his life and teaching, learn about the biblical festivals, and get connected with Israel. Subscribe for free at messiahmagazine.org. Messiah Magazine is a free, donation-supported quarterly publication of First Fruits of Zion.
We are excited to welcome Messianic Jewish scholar, Dr. Jen Rosner. Welcome to Messiah Podcast. Dr. Rosner.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
We're excited to dig into some all kinds of things, actually, when I consider our upcoming questions. We've got a great podcast, but I want to start with something real easy. Your new book, Finding Messiah. I had the pleasure of reading an advanced copy. Thank you. I appreciated your unique approach in this book because it's a personal story, very, very emotional personal story, and a deep theological consideration especially for people, maybe the average church goer, let's say it that way. It's personal and challenging, understandable, I would say, relatable, and probably disruptive to some long-standing theologies. So before we really dive in, I would like to just hear Dr. Jen Rosner's heart behind the new book, Finding Messiah, why you wrote it the way you did, who it's for, what you're hoping it accomplishes. That's kind of a big 3-part question. You can add it all together for us.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. It's a great place to start. I mean, the book is exactly as you said. It's sort of memoir-ish in that it is a telling of at least key chapters of my own story. And that was part of my desire for the book, was to tell my story and to kind of rehearse these different chapters, all of which have had, key relationships, key questions, key tensions that I have been struggling with and that have kind of led me to where I am today. And that includes my academic and vocational journey, my personal journey, meeting and marrying my husband, a couple international moves, all the things that, as I said, have led me to where I am today. And interestingly, my story has really brought me very up close and personal with the kinds of theological and biblical and historical issues that are raised in the book about how do we think about the relationship between Christianity and Judaism? How do we think about, Jesus as Israel's Messiah? How do we think about the letters of Paul? How do we think about Constantine and Martin Luther and all of these really key figures who have shaped our understanding again of Judaism and Christianity today? So it was fun to tell my story in a way that also sheds light on, I think, some really important questions. And so to get to the third part of your question, my hope is that the book doesn't answer all the questions, but I'm hoping to sort of leave readers who are probably mostly Christians with maybe with some cognitive dissonance, things like, wait, how have I been a Christian my whole life and never thought, for example, about how the ritual purity system influenced Jesus' ministry, things that cause us to press a bit deeper into this connection between Judaism and Christianity, this connection between the Christian gospel, the gospel of Messiah, and God's ongoing covenant with the Jewish people. So hopefully in opening up about some of my own, again, tensions and struggles over the years, it's inviting others to a place of embracing those tensions and wading into them and kind of seeing where that leads.
I think it does that and does a tremendous job of gently confronting the something's missing idea that we hear so much in Messianic Judaism. The idea that, oh my goodness, I've been reading the Bible my whole life. I either never understood these things, never knew why they were important, never thought they were relevant, all those things. So just a quick plug right off the top for Finding Messiah. You're going to love it. And what I should have said, and we didn't really talk about it, but you are a disciple of Yeshua, but grew up in a traditional Jewish home. So that's kind of a really important part of why this story is so interesting.
Yeah. And talking about this, something that's missing, we talk about that a lot at First Fruits of Zion, like what Christians are missing out on because of the disconnection from their own texts in a way and from the Jewish heritage. And it reminded me of a conversation you had with Rabbi Stein on your birthright trip. When he asked you sort of the opposite question, he said basically what my wife says to our kids when they ask for McDonald's, which is we have food at home. He said, what's a good Jewish girl like you need some Christianity for? We have religion at home. We have Judaism. Like what was missing in Judaism that caused you to want to become a Christian? And I was thinking about that, and I like the way you answered it in the book. But I was thinking about that because from our perspective at First Fruits, we're always talking about the other side. So I think of what's unique about the teaching of Jesus. Well, prioritizing loving one's neighbor. Well, Rabbi Akiva said that, or something like that. You heard it said, fulfill your vows, but I say, don't make vows at all. Well, Rabbi Meir said that. So what is unique in Yeshua's teachings that you don't really find elsewhere in Judaism?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'd love to speak to that a little bit. I mean, I think the first thing I'd like to say is just to emphasize basically what you've already said. And I think for Christians, it might be surprising to learn that a lot of what Yeshua says has been said by other Jewish sages. It's not completely foreign to a Jewish worldview or a Jewish, set of perspectives. And so I think to just begin that question by noting the overlap, which I think for probably many readers of the book might be surprising to hear how much overlap there actually is. And as I say in the book, in my conversation with Rabbi Stein, my response to him was about Yeshua commanding us to love our enemies. which I don't think is commanded in the same way within Jewish tradition, and which struck me in a really powerful way on my first brush. My first trip to Israel was this birthright trip, and it was my first brush with the ongoing tensions in the land of Israel. And so seeing, among some of my peers on this birthright trip, just almost like a knee-jerk, maybe like visceral fear and antipathy to Arabs in the land. And I was really, really struck by that, in this notion of like, okay, there's very deep-seated issues and tensions and conflict here, but how do Yeshua's words speak into this? So that was the answer that I gave to Rabbi Stein, and I still kind of hold to that today. But I also think that we could take another. We could sort of take a couple other stabs at your question. And I think a lot of that has to do with the subsequent history and the sort of parting of the ways, whereby Jewish tradition has worked really hard to show that Yeshua is not the Messiah. And in doing so, I think it's obscured some of the keys to actually understanding Yeshua's messianic identity. So scholars like Daniel Boyarin in the Jewish world, for example, have done a great deal to raise some of these points. And so if the question is, what did Judaism leave behind in the parting of the ways? I think it sort of marred its own portrait of messianic expectations by trying so hard to show that Yeshua is not the Messiah, right? So then you get all this Jewish, and I think it's important that we understand something about this constant back and forth, sort of mutually exclusive definitions, self-definitions between Judaism and Christianity throughout the centuries, such that Judaism is going to such a great extent to show that Yeshua was not the Messiah that we end up kind of distorting what a Jewish picture of the Messiah might look like, at least according to sources pre-Yeshua's coming. And the other thing that I would say, last answer here, I think one of the most remarkable themes in the New Testament is the way in which it re-envisions the relationship between Jew and Gentile. So all throughout Tanakh, I would say that a repeated theme is this kind of hostility between Israel and the nations. The nations are those who are fighting for, a place in the land. The nations are those who are dragging Israel away from worshiping the one true God. And this is the hostility that we see resolved within the body of Messiah, where Jews and Gentiles together are now serving the God of Israel side by side. And I don't think that Judaism embraces this kind of oneness between Jew and Gentile in the same way. I think the coming of Messiah forces us to radically reconceive, not to do away with the distinction between Israel and the nations, but to reconceive the relationship between them from one of hostility to one of kind of partnership in worship. And I think that the New Testament presents a really remarkable portrait of that.
Yeah, agreed. You made me think of something that I also wanted to ask that is a little less deep, but still very, very important, especially in your life, considering one or together. I want to learn a little bit about something that you are very involved in, Yachad B'Yeshua, and how it formed, and the effect that that's had on you as a Messianic Jew, kind of living literally between two worlds, the traditional Jewish world, the Christian world, and so share a little bit about Yachad B'Yeshua, because I know you're very passionate about your work there and the work that the organization's doing.
Yes, I am. Yachad B'Yeshua is just an incredible community. And as you said, in this kind of in-between existence that I have found myself in for decades, Yachad B'Yeshua is like the one place where I feel like I'm with all the kindred spirits who are also like betwixt and between. And so Yachad B'Yeshua was sort of founded or created out of what began as the Helsinki Consultation on Jewish Continuity in the Body of Messiah. So in the year, I know that's a mouthful, right? In the year 2010, I was invited to join a group of Jewish followers of Messiah from all across the ecclesial spectrum. So we're talking Messianic Jews, Jewish Lutherans, Jewish Catholic priests, Jewish Eastern Orthodox Christian priests, in Helsinki, Finland, to sort of talk about what do we all have in common despite these radically different places on the ecclesial spectrum that we find ourselves. And what we discovered was that we had a lot in common, and we were kind of searching for and were struggling with the same sets of issues in our respective geographical locations, in our respective ecclesial communities. And we felt such a depth of fellowship and connection amidst this really diverse group of Jewish followers of Messiah. So that began what was called the Helsinki Consultation and went on for, I think, 8 years. And then we invited a larger group of Jewish followers of Messiah, again, from all across the ecclesial spectrum and from all across the world, to a conference in Dallas, Texas in the summer of 2018. And what came out of that was what's now called Yachad B'Yeshua, which is a international fellowship of Jewish followers of Jesus, again, from all over the world and from all of these different sort of ecclesial settings. And it's just been such an incredible community that does have quite a few Messianic Jews in it, but that also makes us learn more about what it looks like to be Catholic and Jewish, and to really value both of those identity markers, or to, to struggle with being a Lutheran who's Jewish and the whole Lutheran heritage with all of its good, bad, and ugly. And so it's just been a really rich community to me, and it's provided such an encouragement that one of the common phrases that came up at this 2018 Dallas, Texas conference was existential loneliness, right? We all sort of feel isolated and alone in our churches, in our mainstream synagogues, whatever that might look like as Jewish followers of Messiah. And for me, Yachad B'Yeshua is like the best salve for this existential loneliness, because we're not alone in in feeling kind of alone in this larger religious landscape.
So you spoke to it, but just out of curiosity, what does a Jewish Catholic priest have in common with Dr. Jen Rosner, Messianic Jewish theologian? I mean, just a quick example outside of we're Jewish and we're struggling. Can you, what is it? What does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you bring up particularly the Catholics. What's really interesting from a Catholic perspective, a Catholic Jewish perspective, is liturgical calendars, right? And you think about things like Easter and Passover, or whatever other really significant liturgical events might happen to overlap. And what does it look like to navigate those two calendars, both practically, but also historically? What do we make of the intentional division at the Council of Nicaea between Easter and Passover? How do we hold on to those? And I think for Messianic Jews, it's almost a little bit easier, because we can sort of brush aside the parts of Christian church history that we don't love. But I think if you're a Catholic and you're devoted to the Catholic Church, it's not so easy. And so in some ways, it actually deepens the tensions. And I think it very helpfully reminds us that we have to honor church history. We have to live in a place where we can both embrace, but also maybe push back against some of these developments that make it very, very difficult to live as both a Jew and a follower of Messiah in any kind of meaningful communal context.
Yeah, I bet there are some very long and intense late night conversations that go on there.
Absolutely, there are.
Love to hear some of those. Yeah.
Well, and thinking about some of the thorny issues of embracing both Jewish identity and for Messianic Jews embracing to some degree Jewish theology, Jewish practice, while having also one foot in this other world as a disciple of Yeshua. I bet that there's an issue that comes up, and Michael Visegrad talks about it. I think he called it probably the most difficult issue in trying to reconcile Jews and Christians, is the divinity of Jesus. And you mentioned in your book, you quote Kendall Solon at length, who wrote The God of Israel and Christian Theology, which comes with my highest recommendation. If you buy one book this summer, buy Finding Messiah by Jen Rosner. But if you buy two, maybe consider The God of Israel and Christian Theology by Kendall Solon. It's just that good. It's that important. But you mentioned that in his book, he sort of skirts around the issue. He doesn't talk a lot about what the claim of the divinity of Jesus, the effect that has on Jewish Christian relations, and certainly for a Messianic Jewish person to weigh those claims. And I just sort of wondered, whether that has caused any problems for you, or how you think through those issues. What do you think of how Visegrad approaches it, or how do you approach it? What do you think about all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to sort of set the spectrum here in sort of classic Christian theological terms, we have the issue of a low Christology and all the way up to a very high Christology. So low Christologies tend to emphasize the humanity of Jesus and maybe downplay or ignore any claims to divinity. And then a high Christology, on one extreme can even sort of downplay the humanity of Jesus, or which oftentimes gets linked with the Jewishness of Jesus, right? If we have this Yeshua who's floating around 3 feet off the ground, it's very hard to connect Yeshua to a Jewish context. So that's kind of the spectrum that we're working with, and I think there's dangers in both directions here, which I think makes this conversation very rich and very fraught with potential heresy, right? At least according to classic Christian terms. And I think Solon, I mean, the God of Israel in Christian theology is absolutely, yes, like it is just sort of a book that I think every Christian could learn so much from, in terms of the history, in terms of the development of Christian supersessionism. But I'm not the first to point out that Kendall Solon's proposed solution to the problem of Christian supersessionism in that book, I think kind of downplays the significance of the incarnation and God's coming in Messiah. And Solon himself actually acknowledges this and has really worked very hard in his later writings to present a different and I would say a higher Christology. He also has 2 books coming out pretty soon, I believe, and his book that came out after The God of Israel in Christian Theology, which is on the Trinity, is just phenomenal. So he's gone on, I think, to address this issue in much more robust terms. And I think that to bring up Michael Visegrad is very relevant. And I think Michael Visegrad is so refreshing when he writes on these issues, because he's an Orthodox Jewish thinker who's not just towing the line in terms of the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity, but he's really pushing us to reimagine the whole notion of incarnation from a Jewish perspective. And so what Michael Visegrad wants to say is God, and he uses this very provocative language, God actually became incarnate in the Jewish people as a whole. And so then he wants to say what Christians claim is that incarnation was sort of concentrated in the one person of Yeshua, which Visegrad disagrees with. But I feel like he sort of blows open this sort of a priori claim that, like, well, Jews don't believe in the possibility of incarnation. And he's like, no, that's actually how we should think about God's relationship with the people of Israel. So I think Visegrad is very helpful in terms of laying some Jewish foundation for thinking about the notion of incarnation. And I'll just say, I think, I wrote a book with my brother-in-law, Joshua Lassard, where we're approaching issues, particularly about the coming of the Holy Spirit from our respective perspectives. And he kind of pushes me in that book of not having a high enough Christology. And so I'll say it's an issue that I sit with quite a bit. And I for a few months now, every day I'm reading over Colossians 1, just sort of reflecting on this really lofty language about the coming of Messiah, and continuing to sit with how do we avoid these sort of extremes in what the territory that we venture into one way or the other when we either overplay Messiah's divinity or underplay it. I mean, I think this is a question I'll probably be wrestling with for the rest of my life.
Right. Yeah. We are, it seems we are destined to live in the middle, even in our Christology. I mean, but I want to shift back to the book though, but to speak specifically about something related to Shabbat, to the Sabbath. And you, in the chapter on the Sabbath, you move from saying that Shabbat is Shabbat, and that you can't pick another day. I mean, Shabbat is Shabbat. And then though kind of, and I'm going to push you a little bit on this, then it seems like telling Christians to consider the existence of the Sabbath as basically just a nudge to relax on a day a week, or to take one day per week. So if that question makes sense, I hope it does. What I want to ask really is, would you discourage a Christian from picking the Shabbat as their day, their one day a week to rest, to honor?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I'm so glad to have the opportunity to talk about that a little bit here. So let me lay the ground a little bit before I actually dive into the question. The book Finding Messiah does not definitively answer the question of what should Christians do with all of these questions that I'm hoping to raise in the book. There's not like a 5-step guide as to how Christians should now live their lives differently, or see Jesus differently, or live their weekly rhythm differently. And to be honest, it's a question that I'm getting a lot about Finding Messiah. Like, now what? Or like, so what? Like, what do we do with all this? It's
one of the most common questions that we ever hear in Messianic Judaism, because it's attractive to Gentiles who say, oh my gosh, you showed me what's missing. Okay, thank you. Now what? So I'm sorry. I get it. I bet you are getting a lot of questions. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yes. And I actually just had a conversation with Mark Kinzer, who's been a longtime mentor of mine, about this just a few days ago. And I really hope, here's the teaser. I really hope to write on this topic specifically. I see it as a future project of mine to sort of tease out some of the implications that Finding Messiah raises, this being one of them, this question about Sabbath. And so with that being said, I think, so I would say that along with many other things, Sabbath is part and parcel of God's covenant with the part of Israel, with the people of Israel. And so I think that for a Jew to honor the Sabbath, there's some element of covenant fidelity in that. That is how God has called and commissioned the Jewish people to live, is to have a particular rhythm to the week. I also think that it's very significant to gather for worship on Sunday, which is the Lord's Day. It's not Sabbath, right? So we're not saying Sunday somehow became the Sabbath. I think, again, Shabbat is Shabbat. It always will be. It always has been. But I don't want to undermine the significance that we see already in the New Testament of gathering on the day that Yeshua rose from the dead as a day of worship and as a day to press into what it means to be Messiah's disciple. So I think that this Saturday, Sunday tension is a very early tension for the Yeshua following community. And it's only, and for very good reasons, right? Like the idea of Sunday worship is not originally about the sun god or, whatever else. I think for followers of Messiah, it is originally about marveling over Messiah's resurrection. And so it later becomes this very political division again, which sort of becomes solidified at the Council of Nicaea with Constantine, where you have this really intentional decision to decouple Gentile Christianity from Judaism. So I think there's a lot of history that needs to be pressed in there. And one of the things that I absolutely do not want to do in this book or in anything else I write or say ever is bash the church, right? I think there's too much of that tends to happen in Messianic Judaism, where, it's sort of, this is what's wrong. And Constantine was a pagan and Martin Luther was anti-Semitic. And so therefore we need to sort of just dump all that. I don't think that's the answer. I think that God, I think the Christian church, the Gentile Christian church, is the only place where the gospel of Messiah has been preserved and proclaimed for centuries. So while I'm pushing in the book that we recognize the shadow side of church history, I hope that nobody takes away that we all need to sort of shun all these Christian traditions, which I think are incredibly rich. So my first point is that I actually think there's something very significant about Christians gathering on Sunday, which has become this sort of mainstay of Christian life. And so I wouldn't want to say, oh, no, don't go to your church on Sunday. You need to observe some kind of Sabbath. So there's a lot of complexity from my perspective around this issue. That being said, if a Christian wanted to embrace a Saturday Sabbath that kind of shows a kind of unity with the Jewish people and enters into this kind of richness, I would say absolutely yes. But come to our Shabbat table and enjoy, the beauty and the richness of Shabbat with us as a way for Jews and Gentiles to show oneness, to as a way for Christians to enter into the Jewish reality. But I would hope that would never be at the expense of a very robust affirmation of Christian tradition, and this one perhaps in particular, because I think it's for a very good reason that followers of Messiah began gathering on Sunday. So that's a bit of a jumbled answer, but I think it goes to show that I think these are very complex questions. And I'm not saying in the book that Christians should take on Jewish practices, because I think there's again, that's a pretty fraught territory to head into. Mm-hmm. And I also think, last point, I think different Christians are called to different stances. I think every Christian has something to gain from pressing deeper into the Jewishness of the New Testament, the Jewishness of Messiah, this understanding of God's ongoing covenant with the people of Israel. But I think it's going to look different for different Christians in different communal settings and different, commitments. I think for Christians who are married to Jews, I think for, there's a whole spectrum that I think needs to be honored here in terms of what this might look like for different Gentile Christians in particular to live out.
It's its own podcast. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah, that's
it's a big one. Yeah,
there's so you look at it's almost really difficult to look at Christianity in a monolithic way to begin with. It's taken on so many different forms and different cultures at different times, and a lot of bad, but a lot of good. So I can see that. I can see where this re-engagement with Jewish heritage and is going to look different in different contexts. That makes sense. I have a question that might seem kind of random, but this is really honestly just a personal curiosity that I have that I noticed. So when I first got into the Paul-within-Judaism crowd, which you talk about in your book, there's these academic folks, these PhDs that are seeing Paul within Judaism now. They're jettisoning the quote-unquote Lutheran Paul who is anti-Judaism, and they're embracing a Paul that embraces Judaism. And when I first heard about this, I don't know, 10 plus years ago, and went and got, Mark Nano's books and Pamela Eisenbaum books and all these stuff, started reading about it. I also, because I'm a curious little goblin, went to go see what the traditional people were saying in response to this. So I got like the D.A. Carson and Mark Seifert and Peter T. O'Brien and the Westerholm and all these guys. And what I noticed was all of them that I found were dudes. Whereas on the Paul within Judaism camp, you got Amy Jo Levine and Paula Fredrickson and Jen Rosner and actually quite a few more. So I wanted to ask what you thought. Is this like a coincidence, or is it easier for a woman to revisit traditional assumptions about the New Testament, or what's going on here? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a really, really, really interesting question. And I don't think I've ever quite looked at it in those terms or even noticed it. I mean, I think just on a broader scale, I think it says something about the academy and the way that the academy is changing, and the white male is no longer the default academic voice, which I think is great. I think having women at the table brings about new perspectives in the same way, if we're talking about this sort of Paul within Judaism camp, that having Jews at the table of New Testament scholarship brings new perspective, right? I mean, all of a sudden you have this whole school of Jewish New Testament scholars. So yeah, they're going to see some different things in reading the New Testament than this entire history of 16 plus centuries of Gentile Christian white men reading the New Testament, right? So I think there might be something about Jewish perspectives, women's perspectives, just different perspectives, and we could sort of go on and on about liberation perspectives and all of these different perspectives that are being brought to the table, I think in really, really rich ways. But I think it's also worth pointing out that not all women New Testament scholars follow this line. And in fact, in my own journeys, some of the New Testament professors during my grad school days that challenged me the most in ways that ended up being deeply formative for me, sort of me scratching my head and saying, that can't be right. Were also women, women New Testament scholars throughout my, again, graduate school days who, for example, didn't believe in the resurrection of Yeshua. And I'm like, wait, but, and that kind of forced me to realize, no, everything hinges on the resurrection, right? Like, how can we say that this all matters if the resurrection didn't happen? Or, I had a woman New Testament professor who said, I was really struggling with like the Paul of his letters versus the Paul of Acts, right? Because it kind of seems like Paul in Acts like really, really cares about Torah, and at least according to a traditional reading, Paul in his letters is like, Torah, now we have Yeshua. And I asked her this question, and she said, well, the Paul of Acts isn't historical. So that's like Luke's portrayal of Paul. And so again, there's a spectrum in terms of women New Testament scholars. And I think the women that you mentioned, Pamela Eisenbaum and Paula Fredrickson and Amy Jill Levine are incredible scholars. But I think that at least it's formative in my, exposure to women New Testament scholars are those who kind of forced me to think, no, that's not right. Like, how else can we think about these questions? But again, I think the larger point would just be about, in the academy today, there's a wider range of voices. And I think it's helping us to see the text in new ways and in really helpful ways in this instance.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I mean, I've heard a lot of people complaining about, identity politics or whatever. And it's just like, man, I really enjoy just sitting down and listening to people who have had completely different lives than me, because they see stuff that I wouldn't have seen. And you know what? The more ideas in the marketplace, the happier I am to go through it all and just try to learn something,
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Well, speaking of new ideas, Dr. Rosner in this book has some very some hilarious illustrations. We're talking about Yeshua's cloak at one point, his cloak, like we have Jesus Gandalf, but there's another great, you just have to read the book to catch these, but there's another one where you're talking about Mr. Jesus Potato Head. How we through the ages, we read the Gospels, we read Yeshua's words, we read everything, and we just decide, you know what, let's stick this part on right here because I like the way that looks. There's these theological ears here, and there's this, this resurrection nose, and but I don't like that, so let's not put the feet on because that's so we construct this odd looking Jesus Potato Head. Now, the thing is, there are a lot of things that the church doesn't want to put on their Mr. Jesus Potato Head, things that might be a little bit too Jewish. So in the book, you talk about a lot of things to reconsider. Just pick one. What do you think the hardest thing for someone from an evangelical background would have in reconciling the Jewish Jesus, the Rabbi Jesus of Nazareth? What would be the part you think they dislike most about what we want to put on in Messianic Jewish thought?
Yeah, I mean, it's a no-brainer for me, honestly. And I talk about this a little bit in the book, and it's the ritual purity system, right? It's all the boring stuff in Leviticus that, like, no, certainly that doesn't matter anymore. I feel like I can't tell you, do Christian pastors preach through Leviticus? Because I want to hear what do they have to say about it? Because I think we just skip it most of the time, right? That is the best example of what doesn't matter anymore, is the book of Leviticus. And yet I would say that that's exactly my answer to your question, is the way in which the sort of Levitical ritual purity system actually in a remarkable way undergirds the mission and the ministry of Messiah. And so this was kind of already on my radar screen, but a number of years ago, a book came out by a New Testament scholar called Matt Thiessen called Jesus and the Forces of Death, which is all about, the ritual purity system in the Gospels. And it is just an incredible book. He's such a good scholar. And the way that he shows over and over again that far from just kind of casting aside this whole temple ritual purity system, Yeshua is both working within the bounds of it and showing great reverence for and sort of deference to this system. But there's also something remarkably new that is taking place in Messiah that I think we can appreciate from a different angle when we look at it through this ritual purity system. So actually, it was after reading Matt Thiessen's book that I added a chapter in Finding Messiah on the ritual purity system, which wasn't originally supposed to be there, but I was like, I just have to talk about this. Like, it's just too good not to include. And so I look at this really, I think, curious passage in Matthew 9, where you have this story about the synagogue leader's daughter who has died, and he calls Yeshua to come right away. And Yeshua then gets the story gets interrupted by this woman with the problem of bleeding, which is like euphemistic language for genital discharges, which is a Leviticus thing. And this whole, and she touches, this is the Gandalf passage, right? She touches, Jesus Gandalf's cloak, which are actually his tzitzit, if we want to like go back to the original, text. And then it goes back to this synagogue ruler's daughter who has died that Yeshua puts his hand on. I mean, this is like ritual purity written all over it. I think in order to understand passages like this, it helps so much to have a basic understanding of the ritual purity system, which for Jews, we still think about these things, I mean, in terms of family purity and all these things that are like very, very present in the ongoing life of the Jewish people, but that are probably quite foreign, at least as foreign as any other thing we could talk about here to the average Christian. And to say, wait, like, Yeshua, like to look at Yeshua through this ritual purity lens, I think it makes his ministry all the more remarkable. Again, not that he's throwing it away, but that he's sort of working within the bounds of it. And yet we see something entirely new going on with Yeshua. And he doesn't become ritually impure when he contacts sources of ritual impurity. So there's something amazing and divine there. And in fact, what's happening is that his purity and holiness is like spilling over. It's like, I think Matt Thiessen uses the phrase contagious holiness. But again, we have to know something about this whole system in order to pick up on any of this. So that's my answer to the Jesus potato head question.
And it is so relevant to me right now because this is it's not just a Christian issue. My nephew is studying for his bar mitzvah in just a couple of weeks. His parsha, of course, is Acharei, right? So he's studying with me. I'm reading through Leviticus. A 12-year-old. Now, obviously, Judaism started with Leviticus. That's the tradition. The sacrifices are pure, so why not let the pure children read them? I can't remember exactly where it is, but it's in the Talmud. But when you tell a 12-year-old to start reading about genital discharges and inappropriate sexual behaviors with your, siblings, it's fairly uncomfortable. And so last week we're studying. I said, "What'd you learn?" He goes, "Uncle D." He calls me Uncle D. What do you want me to say about this? I mean, I can't talk about this. So it's a pretty difficult subject, but I think to your point, when it's the easiest thing and I say that we've just talked about how important it is to keep the church in its proper and beautiful place. So I don't say this with any pejorative sense, but it's easier just to say, well, Jesus did away with all that stuff. It's not even worth considering, right? And that's not good. But that brings me to my last question that I want to ask you, and I'm sure Jacob has a little bit more if you can stick with us for another few minutes. But that's what Messianic Judaism does. Messianic Judaism lives in the middle. And we're making those connections. It's the perfect example. Why does Leviticus matter to me? Why do I need to know these things? And so how does that work for you on a practical level? You're expressing hope in the book that we can be the bridge. We talked about Yachad B'Yeshua. It's a bridge. How does Messianic Judaism help Baptist Bob somewhere in Texas develop a tangible connection, not just to the Jewish Jesus, but to the Jewish people?
We help him to talk about genital discharges, of course, right? I mean, I just have to say, your story about your nephew is like, it is so fun to teach about this to undergraduates, because you want to see undergraduates squirm and like avoid eye contact. It's amazing. It's like my favorite day of teaching is when we get to talk about dental discharges. Okay.
This is supposed to be a seminary. We're not allowed to talk about these things.
It's so fun. I just love it. And it's like, that's it. Judaism is very, very embodied. Let's talk about our bodies. Let's talk about how they, interact with our spirituality. So anyway, enough on that. We'll move on.
In Finding Messiah Bodies. It's a great chapter in your book.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it has everything to do with being embodied and recognizing that we are human beings and that Yeshua was a human being. And let's talk about all the implications of that, right?
Yeah.
But to come back to your question, I mean, I do think, and I write in the book about painful experiences where, as a Messianic Jew, I was excluded from certain, settings of Jewish Christian, dialogue meetings and things like that. It's a very sore subject in the larger landscape of Jewish Christian relations. And yet I think that there's really hopeful signs. And I think someone mentioned Mark Nanos already in this podcast. Mark Nanos, actually, who's a major friend of the Messianic Jewish movement, has said, like, you guys are like the living, breathing reality of what I'm trying to study in the first century in pressing into the New Testament. Again, there's obvious differences, but I think you do have certain Jews who say, wait a second, this is actually the embodiment of this reality that, for example, the Paul-within-Judaism camp is trying to trying to sort of discover anew in reading the New Testament. So I think there's so much potential on both sides. And I think, the whole book, my book is geared largely to Christians and wanting them to press into this. But I think the larger point is not just like sort of what can we gain by reading Leviticus and sort of understanding ritual purity, those kinds of maybe a bit more obscure issues, but one of the biggest issues that I want people to consider from the book is God's ongoing election of the Jewish people, which is not just something that was true, in the days of Moses or it's true today. I want Christians to think about Jews as the elect people of God today. And so it does raise all kinds of implications, not only about practices or biblical hermeneutics, how we read our Bibles, but about understanding this non-analogous connection between Jews and Christians. John Howard Yoder says that he's a Christian ethicist, says that Judaism is a non-Christian religion. Like, you cannot just lump it together with Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism as these sort of non-Christian religions. We study those in a sort of world religions class that doesn't, that those are non-Christian religions. That's not true. And I think that in order for Christians to understand their place as sort of God's chosen people, it is in joining. It is that Messiah offers kind of this on-ramp for Gentiles into covenant with the God of Israel, who has been in covenant relationship with the people of Israel long before Messiah ever came. And so there's huge implications in terms of Jewish Christian relations here. And again, because the book is mostly geared towards Christians, I would love to see Christians building relationship with local, Jewish synagogues and learning. There's just one example that comes to mind. Amy Jill Levine wrote this really great piece on how to avoid anti-Judaism at Easter, because this is a time that's so fraught historically in terms of really messy and violent Jewish Christian, hostility. And so I want. I guess I want to bring all of that onto the radar screen of Christians, like how dark the history has been between Jews and Christians, and yet how hopeful it is in our day, in the aftermath of the Holocaust, in the aftermath of the creation of the modern state of Israel, in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council. We're living in this whole new day of Jewish Christian relations. And I truly believe that there will increasingly be space for Messianic Jews at that dialogue table. I think especially as Messianic Judaism gains more academic credibility, I think that it's not going to be excluded forever. And the questions, as you're saying, and this sort of really unique position and perspective that Messianic Judaism is able to offer, I think we're just seeing the beginning of it, to be very honest.
God willing. I
hope so.
That's a good answer.
Yeah, well, and it must feel pretty cool to be a part of it as a Messianic Jewish PhD. Yeah, people like you definitely add credibility to the movement. We're thankful that you exist. We're thankful to have you on the podcast today. I have one more official question, and then we have a fun little thing we like to do right after that. In your book, you contrast two different ideas about freedom, and I really, really like the way that you put this. Because it resonated with me. Because I'm an evangelical American Christian. I was raised real conservative theologically. All my curriculum was all written by fundamental Baptists, right? So there's this. I think you hit it on the head when you said a lot of, at least in Protestantism, freedom is equated to an idea you call liberty, which is freedom from constraint. It's the freedom to kind of do what you want. And in a Christian context, it's freedom from the Old Testament. It's freedom from the purity system. It's freedom from the laws and the rituals and so forth. Whereas in Judaism, you describe an idea that's very different. You call it liberation. And liberation is the freedom from all the horrible things that we would do to ourselves with no direction from God, all of the consequences of a selfish or self-directed life. And the question that came up in my mind when I read that is, do you see the emphasis on liberty, living without constraint in American Christianity as being a particular problem in the American church to unravel, given that liberty in America is not just a religious idea, but a political ideal?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is such a great example of how we just bring our lenses to the text without even really thinking about it, right? They're just so close that I think when we as Americans read the word freedom in scripture, we just instantly have an idea of what that means because of American history, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Like this is what we think of. And without missing a beat, we sort of apply that understanding to the text. And I think this is where it's helpful to not problematize the text, but let's remember that the text that there is some distance between us and the text. And I think this is a great example, again, especially as Americans, where it's all about liberty. Like, do not tell me what to do. Do not tell me what color to paint my house. Do not tell me what, anything. Like, that's what we are all about. And I think it kind of, it skews our understanding of a biblical notion of freedom, which of course has everything to do with constraints, right? Not with doing whatever the heck I want, whenever the heck I want. And I think Judaism, the way that it instructs us of what we do and don't do with our bodies, with how we structure our time, like it seems to sort of just like surface level American culture, like, heck no, like, no, I don't want all those restraints. But that's biblical freedom, and that's Christian discipleship, even if we want to, divorce it from Jewish practices. So I do think it's a particular problem for Americans and maybe for Westerners in general. I think part and parcel of that is this individualism that's tied into the American story, right? Like, I think part of what, as Western or American Christians, we can learn from the people of Israel piece is this communal, corporate aspect that is a big stretch for us. It goes along with the liberty thing. Like, it's the me thing. Like my iPod and my iPhone, like it's all about me, right? And the Enlightenment just kind of feeds right into this. So, I think that these aspects of our culture, which of course have like a very rich history behind them, like I'm a big Hamilton fan, right? Like, let's all talk about the history of our country. But they do kind of sometimes cheat us of a deeper, more biblical understanding of certain key concepts like freedom. And I think this also relates back to something we were talking about earlier, that, with regard to the Sabbath question, right? Should Gentile Christians observe Sabbath? I think that Jewish tradition is valuable. Like, every Christian is going to have their faith enriched by learning more about Jewish tradition and God's covenant with people of Israel across the board. I think it's going to look different for different people. And so for Americans who are used to liberty and individualism, like, I think we have a set of things to learn from God's covenant with the people of Israel and the gift of Torah within that covenant. I think if we're talking to, West Africans, for example, there might be a different set of things. That's a very communal culture. I think this is why it's problematic to have like a sort of a one size fits all answer for how Christians ought to engage Judaism or Jewish practices. I think it really depends on culture and context and calling and communities. That was alliteration there. Did you get that? All these
good.
different factors that it's not cookie cutter. You know, I think these are complex questions. And one of the things I want to do is sort of honor where different Christians or Jews or Messianic Jews, I mean, this is the whole Yachad B'Yeshua thing, right? We're not telling everybody that they need to live like I do as a Messianic Jew. It's trying to learn from each other as we approach a common set of questions and concerns. And so I think this is maybe another example of that.
Well, that's you've given us a lot to think about. We've learned a lot from you. I learned a lot reading your book. And I just really enjoyed it. But we're not done yet, because at the end of every podcast, we like to have a rapid fire round with questions that we don't give to the guest in advance. And we're going to ask you to answer these off the top of your head. The only thing I can promise is that the stakes are low. So, Jen Rosner, PhD, favorite airport to hang out in?
Heathrow.
Nice. Favorite old school vineyard song from back when you were going to a vineyard church?
Oh, nice. I can't remember what it's called, but it's like, we lift our holy hands up, right? Does anybody know this song? What's it called? That's kind of the chorus.
Jacob's
now you're putting me on the spot. I'm getting nervous.
That's exactly what we wanted.
Perfect. Thank you.
We'll Google it later, and
okay.
we'll look
Put
it up
in
and
the
we'll
show
listen
notes.
to it. Right. We will. Favorite variety of apple to dip in honey on Rosh Hashanah? Are you a Red Delicious person, or you got something better?
Oh no, Honey Crisp. Honey
Crisp.
If you haven't tried it, go buy one. Honey Crisp.
No, that would have been my answer. That would have been my answer. So for all of our listeners who track the podcast, Fuji and Honey Crisp tied for first. You get to have lunch with one historical figure named Moses, but you can't pick the Moses. Who do you pick?
Moses Mendelssohn.
That was also my choice. We're twinsies.
Oh my gosh.
Now, this is the last question I have for you, and it's a question I get a lot. And from now on, your answer that you give now is going to become my answer to other people. High school students, undergrads, they ask me, where should I go for an undergrad, or where should I go for a master's, to where I'm going to get exposure to the Jewish Jesus, to Paul-within-Judaism. I don't just want a traditional view that hasn't taken any of the new scholarship into account. Where should these people be applying?
You know, I sound very biased in saying this because I happen to teach here, but the King's University in Texas is amazing. And my good friend David Rudolph is the director of the Messianic Jewish Studies program there. Undergraduate, master's program, D-Min program, all with these kinds of questions in mind, all fully accredited. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that in my opinion.
There you go.
All right. Plug for the King's University. Weren't you going to go there, Damian? I heard...
I didn't pass the background check.
Oh, there you go.
No.
Well,
just kidding. No.
Damian, reconsider, man.
I will.
Okay. It's such a great program. I have to say, I just tell everybody that they should go there. And we talk about general discharges there. So just, get that on the record as well.
I'm sold. And so will my nephew. He now knows his future path.
Totally.
He's going to spend the rest of his life speaking. Thank you, Jen. Appreciate you so much. And in so many ways, thank you for your contributions to the Messianic Jewish movement, to your sensitivity to not being what I would call a Messianic Jewish bully, knocking people over with ideas like bowling pins and saying this is what you have to believe. That's you referenced that in the podcast. Too much of Messianic Judaism has been guilty of that when trying to deal with our Christian brothers and sisters. So, and just thank you for your incredible scholarship. And I'm looking forward to the next book that you hinted at. We've got a pretty strong book list that's from this podcast that we're going to have to put in the notes. But speaking of books, your book is currently available for pre-order, correct?
Mm-hmm, correct.
Releases on?
May 24th.
May 24th. How can people connect with you to learn more about what's happening in Dr. Jen Rosner's life?
You can go to my website, jenrosner.com. You can find me on Twitter. You can find me on Facebook. You can subscribe to my monthly newsletter where you get to hear all of my musings. And I would love to connect with listeners, with readers. That is my joy, to sort of make connections and be together on the journey.
Excellent. Thank you for spending time with us today. May Hashem continue to bless the work of your hands and your heart and your mind.
Thank
Amen.
you so much for having me.
Torah Club is the world's fastest growing Messianic Jewish Bible study. You can start or join a club today at torahclub.org. Know Jesus better through an in-depth small group Bible study and fellowship with other like-minded disciples. Start a club or join a club at torahclub.org. Torah Club is where disciples learn.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed that. One of my favorite parts of talking with Jen is her absolute relatability, and that comes through in the book. She's gonna be able to reach a wide audience with this book. Not that it's gonna be easy material for everyone, but the thing about having her on our team, so to speak, in Messianic Jewish scholarship is that she is sensitive to the audience, and I think so often we talked about it a little bit in there, the Messianic bully who says, Easter, Christmas, all the things that they're so played out and they're so unhelpful. So you are a good evangelical Christian boy, Jacob.
Yeah, I think I'm still in good standing with the evangelical church, as far as I know.
You'll have to be that. Well, I'll leave that. But
like, there's one big evangelical church with a bunch of people around a table. John Piper is there, and Andy Stanley's there, and they're excommunicating people who start speaking Hebrew. I don't know, but no, I'm in good standing with my little evangelical church that I go to, and here in the middle of nowhere in Michigan.
Well, I would think that her attitude would be what you would like to hear: refreshing and sensitive to, the people you interact with pretty regularly.
Yeah, and she's got a lot of assets to draw on, a lot of strengths. I mean, she is Jewish. She went to church for a long time, and after becoming a Christian, she's lived in Israel. All of these experiences have given her a sensitivity, I think, to all the different kinds of ears that this message can land on. And she has developed a really good way of talking about these issues that can reach a broad audience. So for those of our listeners who are maybe looking for some books they can give out to their friends who are confused about what they believe, this might make the list of something that's provocative without being offensive or judgy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is. It's very, very approachable. And, I appreciated, we pushed just a little bit. We talked about Christology and Gentile practice in Messianic Jewish synagogues. I hope that she will consider writing that book that takes that to the next level, because that really is its own podcast. That is like the $5 million question. I'm a Gentile. What do I do?
Yeah. And so you have people from a really diehard, like, for example, my background, what I was taught in my school curriculum and even in like college was that the goal was to be as close to the first generation disciples as possible. Like the real true church, the way it has to look, if it's going to be spirit filled and if it's going to be accurate, like historically, it should look like it did in the book of Acts, right? And then once you learn what it looked like in the book of Acts, you start thinking, well, it was Judaism. So is this if you still have that other idea in your head that's what I have to do, that's the only real way to do following Jesus, then you're going to really have a lot of questions, and you're going to start drifting toward trying to take some of this stuff into your life and how to do that in a respectful way, and what to do and when. These are, like she said, they're complex questions, and I think people are going to come up with different answers to them, and depending on their context.
Yeah, that was something I really appreciated. As she said, the real answer to this to the $5 million question is there is not an answer to the $5 million question, and she stated that you can't just is it a square peg in a round hole or a round peg in a square hole? It seems like the round peg would actually fit in the square hole, so it can't be that.
Yeah, it would really depend on the size of the peg. You could get just about any peg in just about any hole as long as the peg is small enough.
It's a stupid analogy or whatever it is. But the point being that where you're coming into this is going to absolutely affect what you do, what you're encouraged to do, what you want to do. There's no, we have the Didache, and everyone says, all right, that, there was the instruction manual. Well, maybe 1900 and some years ago, it's different now. It has to be approached very, very carefully and gently. So I don't think we're going to provide that answer, even with Dr. Rosner's new book. God willing, it comes out. I
think, we'll stumble forward together is the way I look at it. I mean, on a geological time scale, Messianic Judaism is pretty young. We have maybe future generations will continue the conversation. We do have a sense of urgency, I think, that we have to get this figured out right now, or we're living in sin or something like that.
Right.
I think there's an element of this we have to trust God with. We have to trust that he's leading us as a community, and even if no individual has all the answers, he's working in our midst, and over time, maybe things will become clearer to us. Not that absolves us of the responsibility to study and try things and talk about it, but under the umbrella of understanding that God is the one who's moving here, and we're just part of a much bigger picture.
What'd you say? Stumbling forward together?
Yeah, stumbling forward together.
I like that. We do that at my congregation here. Got a very, very diverse group of people, and there's actually no instruction manual outside of,
really?
You mentioned the Acts. Like, yes, let's go back to the Acts church. All right. Well, that means we have to start arguing about forced circumcisions. Is that, do we want to, we headed back that way? I mean, we are adapting into a new time, and people like Jen Rosner are going to help us do that. I'm glad, as we said in the podcast, I'm glad she's on the team.
Yeah. Yep. We need all the PhDs we can get.
That's it. All right, man. Appreciate it. Thank you to all of our faithful Messiah podcast listeners. We will speak with you next time. Blessings.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Messiah Podcast, where Jesus is Jewish, and that changes everything. This podcast is an extension of Messiah Magazine, available at messiahmagazine.org. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a review along with a 5-star rating wherever you're listening now. Today's podcast was hosted by myself, Jacob Fronczak, along with Damian Eisner. Our executive producer is Boaz Michael, and the editor-in-chief is Daniel Lancaster. This episode was directed and edited by Jeremy Schoenwald. Original music was written and performed by Joshua Aaron. The show notes for Messiah Podcast were edited by Candy Bishop and are available at messiahpodcast.org. If you are interested in learning more about the Bible from a Messianic Jewish perspective, check out Torah Club, which is an international network of small study groups who meet weekly to study the Bible together from a Messianic Jewish perspective. To start a club or join a club, go to torahclub.org. Until next time, shalom.
Let his word cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea. Let his love cover you and me, like the waters cover the sea.